Libera Me. Deliver me, Lord, from everlasting death on that dreadful day when heaven and earth shall be shaken, when you shall come to judge the world by fire. I am in terror and trembling until the judgment be upon us and the coming wrath when heaven and earth shall be shaken. That day of wrath, disaster, misery, day of great and overwhelming bitterness, eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. Serious stuff. Dies irae, day of wrath. They're not easy words. Verdi and Mozart set them to shattering crescendi, huge choruses. Britain, in the war Requiem, sets it to the unrelenting tramp of approaching fate. All Requiem settings seem to build to and then decline from this yell of terror. All, that is, except Fauré. He doesn't set the Dies Irae at all. It has an echo in the Libera Me, which is what I'm talking about, and that briefly bursts into flame, but the storm is soon over and we return to the plea for deliverance. In this, Fauré, I think, is out of his time. When the bulk of his Requiem was composed, is 1888, 87, 88, European music was in a grand, heroic phase. This is, after all, the high watermark of the German tradition. Wagner was king, Beethoven was God, Mahler was emerging, and Fauré's intimate, harmonic, simple style was entirely the opposite of all these. France, remember, was still smarting from defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and Fauré was certainly caught up in the consequences of the defeat and the short-lived Paris Commune that followed it. And maybe this explains why French culture reacted against the heroic, reaching for its antithesis. Remember, this is also the time of Impressionism in art, and I always feel that Fauré is an impressionist in music. Well, whatever the reason, his gentle and prayerful setting is now probably the most popular concert version of the Requiem. I said just now that he was out of his time. He was, in fact, ahead of it. He was ahead of it, as we know, in his musical language, but also in his treatment of the religious content, of the meaning of the words. When I was a boy in the 1960s, the reform of the Catholic liturgy following the Second Vatican Council eliminated the Dies Irae as a necessary part of the Mass for the Dead altogether. In the words of Archbishop Bonini at the time, he said they got rid of texts that smacked of a negative spirituality inherited from the Middle Ages, texts that emphasized judgment, fear and despair. They replaced these with texts urging Christian hope and faith in the resurrection. Well, this is Fauré. He anticipated this by 80 years. The only part of the Dies Irae proper that he used at all was to set the final couplet, which is Pie Jesu, as a movement in itself, and that is not really, that's an addition to the Dies Irae. And this lovely fragment, the Pie Jesu, is the soul of his Requiem. If you want to understand the novelty of what Fauré did with the Requiem setting of Libera Me, and remember he was an accomplished organist, the incumbent at two big Paris churches, Saint-Sulpice and later the Madeleine, so he knew the established music for the funeral rites off by heart. And if we want to understand the novelty of what he did, we have to understand the place of this prayer in the liturgy. The Libera Me and indeed the In Paradisum were never part of the Requiem Mass itself. They are prayers for forgiveness said after the Mass, now often said as the body is taken from church or as part of committal. Throughout the Requiem itself, the body is in the midst of a community, and the prayers are for the church, the departed, for the community themselves, until with Libera Me, the choir speaks for the only time, and the only time in this Requiem as well, in the voice of the deceased. Deliver me, Lord. Deliver me, Lord. The choir is the departed. And Fauré's setting is personal, it's intimate. It's the soul alone approaching God. There's that crotchet rhythm in the bass. It's a heartbeat. Bum, 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 bum. And then the plea for deliverance, which builds in intensity. And then, and only then, the insurgent terror of the Dies Irae, subsiding once more to the plea for eternal rest. But now, Fauré takes us back into the first person. The whole choir becomes the voice of the deceased, this time more confident. And the movement ends with the soul repeating its appeal, but now with the assurance of hope. If you look at the return of the solo baritone, it's marked dolce. All fear is assuaged. In fact, the Libera Me that we know now dates from the early months of Fauré's tenure at Saint-Sulpice. It was composed 10 years before the rest of the Requiem in 1877 for chamber choir and organ, and it didn't appear in the original Petit Requiem, as he called it, of 1887, and for that matter, neither did the offertorium. That was added in two stages, the Hostias in 1889, and finally the rest of the offertorium in 1890, which was also when the Libera Me was slotted in. It's quite interesting, a bit difficult, but it's interesting to imagine what the work sounded like without those two movements. But it is undeniably stronger as a result of Fauré's basically fiddling about with the components. He had, after all, intended the whole thing for local use, so he probably felt entirely happy about this piecemeal change, this evolution. He conceived the whole thing as a chamber work with organ accompaniment. Well, it didn't stay local, of course. During the 1890s, the Requiem grew in popularity until Fauré eventually gave way at the insistence of his publishers, Hamel, that there should be a large-scale version, and this was given its premiere in 1900 at the Exposition Universelle in Paris with 250 performers, large scale as it would often be done today. The rest, as they say, is history. But perhaps Fauré's attitude to the enlargement of the work is best summed up by the fact that he had no appetite for doing the orchestration, and he left that to a pupil. I think he always meant this to be personal and centred on the fate of the individual soul. So perhaps our treatment is more faithful to his intentions than we may have realised, although, of course, he could not have possibly dreamt of the way it's being done by the part singer's friend.